Evelyn and Marcus thought it was just an abandoned graveyard, a place for forgotten souls, but when they wandered through its foggy paths, they realized some things buried there never stayed dead, and now they were being watched. I never thought I would find myself wandering through a graveyard at night, not alone, and certainly not out of curiosity. Yet there I was, drawn by something I couldn't name, stepping carefully along the cracked, uneven stones that formed the old path. The air was thick and cold, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. The clouds above were low and heavy, obscuring the moon, leaving the world around me in a dim, gray haze. I could see little, but that didn't stop me from noticing every small detail. The way the fog curled and twisted around the stones, the way the wind whispered through the dead branches overhead, carrying with it a smell of wet earth and decay that made my stomach twist. The gravestones themselves seemed alive in the dim light, leaning at unnatural angles. Some almost toppled, others cracked or crumbling entirely. Their inscriptions were faded, eroded by years of wind and rain, and in many cases completely unreadable. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I imagined the names carved into those stones long ago. Names that once belonged to people who had walked the same earth as me, who now rested here in silence. Yet there was no peace here, not in this place, not tonight. I walked slowly, almost cautiously, every step making a hollow thud against the ground. The silence was so complete it felt heavy, suffocating. No animals stirred, no birds called out, only the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind pushed through the skeletal trees. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if the world had paused and held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I noticed them footprints in the soft mud between the graves. Fresh footprints. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. They were human, but irregular, as if whoever made them had been limping or dragging something behind them. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but some part of me was rooted to the spot, compelled by a curiosity I didn't want to admit. I followed the trail carefully, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil, the footprints leading me deeper into the heart of the graveyard. The trail ended abruptly at a grave that didn't look like the others. The stone was polished, smooth and dark, almost black, standing out among the cracked and weathered tombs surrounding it. It seemed new, yet the graveyard was supposed to be abandoned. I leaned closer, trying to read the name etched into the surface. That's when I felt a chill that didn't come from the night air, running down my spine, prickling the hair on my arms. The letters on the stone seemed to shift under my gaze, bending and twisting into shapes I couldn't understand. My chest tightened as an unease I couldn't explain settled over me. I was about to step back when I felt it, a brush against my shoulder, cold, heavy, and unmistakably real. I spun around, my flashlight cutting a shaky beam through the mist, but there was nothing, only fog and the crooked stones, silent and unmoving. My heartbeat thrummed painfully in my ears, loud enough to drown out the whisper of the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the night was playing tricks on me, that my imagination had run wild. But then I saw it. A shadow crouched low between two graves, moving with a speed no human should be capable of. It darted in short, jerking motions, disappearing and reappearing as if it were slipping in and out of reality. My breath caught in my throat as it paused for just a moment, turning its featureless face toward me. Hollow eyes like dark pits that seemed to pierce through me. Then it vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving only an echo of dread in its wake. I took a step back, heart hammering, mind screaming at me to leave, but some strange part of me remained frozen in fascination. I couldn't look away from that grave, from the empty space where the shadow had been. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint whisper carried on the wind, calling my name, but not quite human. I could feel it pressing against my mind, a sense of being watched, of something waiting, patient and hungry. I didn't know what it wanted, or why I had been drawn here, but I realized with a cold certainty that I had crossed into something that didn't belong to the living. And just as I took a hesitant step backward, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, shapes flickering between the stones, too quick, too fluid to be human. And then, just for a split second, one of them paused, and I could swear it was staring directly at me, smiling with a mouth that wasn't really there, before disappearing again into the fog. The next night I couldn't stay away. My mind kept replaying the shadow I had seen, the hollow eyes, and the feeling of cold fingers brushing my shoulder. Every corner of my room seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards sounded louder, as if something were waiting for me to return. I told myself it was just curiosity, a foolish need to understand what I had seen, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was being pulled back, almost against my will, into the heart of that graveyard. The air was even colder this time, sharper, biting at the skin that wasn't protected by my jacket. Mist clung to the ground like living smoke, swirling around the bases of gravestones, hiding the uneven paths and hollowed graves beneath. The cemetery seemed larger than I remembered, the rows of stones stretching endlessly, fading into shadows that the weak light of the moon couldn't touch. The silence was worse than before. It felt as if the world had forgotten this place entirely, leaving it to rot, forgotten, but not abandoned. I wandered deeper, each step slower than the last, afraid of what I might see if I moved too quickly. The whispers began almost immediately, faint at first, almost playful, brushing against my ears like a breeze through dead leaves. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew steadily louder, sharper, until I felt like I could feel the voices pressing into my skull. They were words I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, hungry, expectant, like they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. Then I saw them. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by the crooked gravestones, but they moved deliberately, gliding between the stones with a rhythm that no living thing could replicate. Faces pressed against the cracked surfaces of the tombs, pale and twisted, eyes wide and hollow, mouths open in silent screams. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely not either. My stomach turned as I realized they were watching me, studying me, waiting. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs refused to respond, frozen by fear and fascination. I followed a narrow path between the oldest graves, their stones mottled and broken. With every step I noticed something new. Names I hadn't seen before appeared on the stones, etched as if by some invisible hand. They weren't random names. They were familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. Names I knew, names I had encountered in my life. Names I recognized from the news, from stories, from people who had disappeared or died mysteriously. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, but the letters were real, and they were fresh, glistening with dew in the dim light. One grave, in particular, caught my attention. It had been empty before, just a mound of dirt with no marker, no sign of life or death. Now etched into the soil was a single word: look. My throat tightened, and I felt bile rise in my stomach. I knelt closer, squinting to make sense of the letters, but as I did, the whispers turned into voices. Not soft this time, but urgent, frantic, almost pleading, as if hundreds of mouths were screaming into my ears at once. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, my breath coming in short gasps. Then I saw them move in unison, rising from the soil in front of me. Not fully, not yet, just enough to see shapes, pale, elongated forms, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted. They moved toward me slowly, deliberately, as if testing the boundaries of reality itself. My mind screamed at me to run, and I did, stumbling over roots and broken stones, mist swirling around my legs, wrapping me in its cold embrace. When I reached the edge of the graveyard, I dared to look back. The forms had vanished, but the whispers remained, carried by the wind like a promise. I could still see movement in the fog, shadows shifting between the stones, always just out of reach, always watching. And as I turned to leave, I felt it again, the cold touch on my shoulder, heavier this time, pressing into my skin like it belonged there, like it was claiming me before I even understood what was happening. I ran into the night, not stopping until the cemetery was far behind me, but even then, I could feel them, watching, waiting, whispering, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would be there again, tomorrow night, and every night after. Sleep was impossible that night. My mind raced with the images of hollow eyes and twisted faces, the whispers that had clawed at my thoughts in the graveyard. Every shadow in my apartment seemed alive, stretching and shrinking when I wasn't looking, and every creak of the floorboards made me flinch, convinced it was the soft shuffle of unseen feet. I told myself it was just my imagination, that fear could twist reality into nightmares, but deep down I knew better. Something had marked me. Something from that graveyard was following me. By the next evening, I could no longer resist. I needed answers. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to the cemetery, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The mist greeted me like a living thing, curling around my ankles and climbing higher with each step. The graveyard seemed larger than ever, the crooked stones stretching into shadows that disappeared in the dim light. I had walked this path before, but tonight, it felt like the ground itself was alive, guiding me, urging me deeper. I moved cautiously toward the oldest part of the cemetery, where the stones were cracked and weathered, sunken deep into the earth. The whispers began again, faint at first, teasing like they wanted me to listen closer. I tried to ignore them, but the sound grew steadily, layering over itself until it became a cacophony of murmurs, unintelligible yet unmistakably urgent. I felt as though the ground was vibrating beneath my feet, echoing the frantic rhythm of the whispers. Then I noticed it. A small clearing I hadn't seen before, centered around a grave that was unlike any other. The soil was fresh and dark, soft like wet clay, yet no marker, no stone, not even a simple mound. It radiated an unnatural presence, something wrong in its silence. My flashlight flickered as I knelt beside it, the beam revealing shallow depressions in the dirt, as though something had been moving beneath the surface. My pulse quickened, a cold dread settling into my stomach. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of rotten iron. I could see the mist swirling unnaturally around the grave, forming shapes that weren't there before. My hands shook as I reached toward the dirt, driven by a mix of curiosity and horror. As soon as my fingers brushed the surface, the ground beneath me seemed to breathe, pulsing and shifting like it was alive. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and when I looked back, the soil had changed. Words were etched deeply, carved as if by claws. "You belong here. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Shadows began to gather between the surrounding gravestones, shapes forming slowly, deliberately. Pale, elongated figures emerged from the earth, their forms writhing as if they were still growing. Hollow eyes fixed on me, empty mouths opening in silent screams that seemed to reverberate in my mind. My chest tightened with panic, but the longer I stared, the more I realized these things weren't fully solid. They flickered in and out of existence, a horrifying dance between reality and nightmare. I turned to run, my flashlight bobbing wildly, but the path I had taken earlier was gone. The stones had shifted, forming a labyrinth I didn't recognize. The whispers turned into a chant, rising in volume, relentless, as if calling my name, demanding my attention. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, yet I found myself moving deeper into the maze, drawn by some invisible force. Then I saw them, the shadowy forms rising faster now, closer, their limbs stretching unnaturally, crawling over the soil as if it were liquid. One paused just long enough for me to see its face clearly, and I realized with horror that it was grinning. Not a human smile, but something twisted and cruel, filled with a malevolence that made my stomach churn. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots and broken stones, the mist wrapping around me like fingers, slowing me down, pushing me back toward the clearing. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning, yet I could feel their presence behind me, relentless, unyielding. And as I reached the edge of the clearing, I looked back one last time. The figures had returned to the soil, sinking slowly, but the words remained, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "You belong here." My heart sank. I understood now. They weren't just haunting the graveyard, they were marking me, claiming me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, no matter how desperately I tried to escape, I knew I was already theirs. By now I could no longer tell where fear ended and reality began. Days had passed since my last visit to the graveyard, yet the images haunted me as if they had imprinted themselves onto my very skin. Shadows lingered in corners that should have been empty, and every sound in my apartment, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind against the window, made me jump. I thought that by avoiding the graveyard, I could escape it. But the truth was terrifying. It had already followed me home. I could feel it in my thoughts, pressing against the edges of my mind, whispering things I didn't want to hear. The pull was irresistible. I tried to ignore it for days, but eventually I found myself walking back along the cracked paths, flashlight in hand, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The mist greeted me again, thick and clinging, curling around the gravestones like living smoke. It seemed almost to shift with my movements, forming shapes that disappeared whenever I looked directly at them. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of wet earth, decay, and something else I couldn't name, something acrid and metallic that made my throat burn. I returned to the oldest section of the cemetery, where the stones leaned and cracked, their inscriptions almost completely erased by time. The whispers began as soon as I stepped between the graves, soft and taunting at first, brushing against my ears like a cold wind. I tried to focus, tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, layering over one another until it became impossible to think. I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences, promises and warnings intertwined in a maddening chorus. Then I noticed the ground. It was crawling with footprints, but not human ones. They were too small, too sharp, clawed and uneven, leading in spirals and circles around the stones. They moved in ways that no living creature could manage, weaving between the graves and vanishing under the mist. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Whoever or whatever had been here before me had not walked. It had slithered, crept, moved in a way that belonged to something otherworldly. I approached the clearing in the center, my stomach twisting in apprehension. The fresh grave awaited me, its soil dark and soft, but tonight, something had changed. The earth was writhing, shifting like it had a heartbeat of its own. Shadows pooled over it, and I could see elongated shapes beneath the surface, stretching, twisting as if trying to emerge. My flashlight flickered, and I realized I wasn't just seeing movement in the soil, I was seeing movement in the shadows themselves. And then it rose. Not fully, not yet, but enough to make my blood run cold. A tall, emaciated form, pale and slick, like wet clay, slowly emerged from the ground. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending in angles no human joint should bend. Its face was a nightmare, featureless except for dark, hollow eyes that locked onto me, and a mouth that stretched wider than possible, grinning in a way that made my stomach lurch. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, my breath ragged, my heart hammering. The ground around me pulsed with life, or something like it, and I realized in horror that the soil wasn't just hiding more of the myth, was alive, feeding the forms that clawed their way to the surface. I could hear scratching beneath my feet, faint at first, then frantic, as if whatever was below wanted out. The whispers rose into a chant, calling my name over and over, louder and louder, until I could feel the vibration in my bones. I raised my flashlight, trying to capture the form with the beam, but it flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. The shape loomed closer, and the mist seemed to thicken around it, shrouding it in a moving blackness that defied the weak moonlight. Then I saw it under the grave, freshly etched in the dirt, glowing faintly in the dim light. I froze as my eyes locked on the name. It was mine. I felt my legs give way beneath me, my knees hitting the cold, damp earth. The whispers turned into a single voice, low and cold, repeating over and over, "You belong here." My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I could feel their presence closing in, the shadows stretching, twisting, toward me from all sides. I scrambled backward, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The forms were relentless, and the earth beneath my fingers pulsed as if mocking my struggle. A sudden, icy touch grazed my shoulder, stronger this time, and I realized with a sinking horror that whatever was here did not just want to scare me. It wanted to claim me, and as I lay there, heart hammering, shivering in the mist, I understood with dreadful clarity that I had never truly entered the graveyard alone. Something had entered me, too long before I had set foot on its haunted paths. I ran that night, faster than I had ever run in my life, the mist swirling around me like living hands, clawing at my jacket, tugging at my legs. The shadows were relentless, slipping between the gravestones, following my every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers chased me, louder now, filling the air around me, 1,000 voices shouting my name in unison. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear propelled me forward, out of the graveyard, into the darkness beyond. When I finally reached the road, my hands shook as I fumbled with my keys. The engine roared to life, headlights slicing through the night. I drove blindly, barely noticing the road ahead, the trees, the fog. My apartment, my home, my safe place. It was no longer safe. I knew they had followed me. I could feel it, pressing against me, burrowing into my thoughts, leaving no corner of my mind untouched. Back in the city, the world seemed normal, but I could feel their eyes wherever I went. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, vanishing when I turned to look. At night, the whispers returned, softer now, but no less menacing. I began to notice patterns, the way my walls seemed to shift, the way the floorboards creaked even when no one walked on them. I would wake to the sensation of cold fingers brushing across my skin, fingers that weren't there. I realized that leaving the graveyard had not freed me. It had only brought the curse with me. I tried to convince myself I could ignore it, that if I stayed busy, stayed awake, I could survive. But the feeling grew stronger each day. I started seeing movement at the edge of my vision, shadows flickering across walls, shapes shifting in the mist of my apartment. At night I would hear scratching at the walls, soft at first, like claws testing the surface, then louder, desperate, insistent. Something was trying to get in, something that had been born from that cursed ground. One evening I returned to the graveyard in my mind, tracing the path I had taken, trying to understand what had followed me. I remembered the fresh grave in the center, the one that pulsed with life, the one where shapes had risen from the soil. I remembered the name etched in dirt, glowing faintly in the moonlight. My name. The realization hit me like ice. They hadn't marked the grave for me, they had marked me for the grave. Sleep became impossible. I could no longer distinguish dreams from reality. Shadows whispered to me in the daylight, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. Objects moved when I wasn't looking, subtle at first, then more aggressively. My camera, my flashlight, nothing could protect me. I began recording, trying to document what I saw, but even on film, the shadows flickered in ways the camera couldn't capture. Forms appearing and vanishing, shapes that seemed to exist between frames, between worlds. Then, one night, I woke to find the bedroom floor covered in fresh dirt. My heart stopped. I traced it with trembling fingers, and the soil shifted under my touch, as if alive. And there it was again. Words scratched into the dirt, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was writing them just for me. You belong here. I didn't know what to do. I tried to leave the city, to disappear, to escape, but no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place, I could feel them following, in the rearview mirror. At night I saw shadows standing at the horizon, their hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking, patient. The whispers grew louder, calling, demanding, promising that one day I would stop running. And then the final horror. One evening, I glanced at the mail. There was a small package, unmarked, heavy. Inside was a handful of soil, dark and damp, and a single polished stone. Etched into the surface was a name, not mine. At first I felt relief. Then, I realized with icy dread that it was the name of my closest friend. The whispers began again, louder this time, right in my ears, chanting, "You belong here." I dropped the package, stumbling backward, heart pounding. I understood now. I wasn't just being haunted. I was the beginning of something far worse, something that could reach anyone, anywhere. And as I backed away from the door, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move, gathering, stretching, reaching toward me. I don't know how long I can last. The whispers never stop, the shadows never leave. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I know the graveyard is still waiting, always waiting, for the day I can no longer run. And I fear that when that day comes, I won't just belong there, I will lead them back. And then I heard it, the soft scrape of claws against the apartment floor, moving closer, circling me, patient and deliberate, and I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that the nightmare had only just begun.